Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Certainly those facts are undeniable and that you've laid out. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. We have two very good witnesses on this subject with somewhat divergent views, but certainly people that know this subject. Let me start by saying at the beginning of the Biden administration, the president's Iran policy was abundantly clear, and that was an attempt to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal regardless of the cost. The administration chose engagement and appeasement over containment and isolation. 3 years later, Iran is more emboldened and empowered than before, and the Middle East is in turmoil. Iran has dramatically expanded operations against the United States. Israel is decisively engaged against Iranian proxies in Gaza, and Lebanese Hezbollah is poised to enter the conflict. The Houthis are being fueled and directed by the Iranians, and Iran is moving into the Horn of Africa. Iran is building its proxy network in Sudan and backing the Sudanese armed forces. Threats are multiplying, and attacks against Americans are at an all-time high. While nuclear negotiations have collapsed, the administration has failed to enforce sanctions, unfrozen Iranian assets in exchange for Americans, allowed Iranian drones and ballistic missiles to fuel Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and stood by while Iran uses its oil and its oil reserves to fund its lifestyle. As Iran marches across the Middle East, the Biden administration has still not articulated a coherent Iran policy outside of the nuclear negotiations. It's time to change course. Iran is an enduring national security challenge and requires a serious policy that uses all instruments of national power. First, we must adopt a policy of containment. Iran does not think like the West, and it cannot be talked or charmed into a change of conduct. While the regime may make tactical concessions, we must recognize and accept Iran's long-standing strategic hostility towards the United States. Second, we must better deny the regime the resources it uses to support terrorism. It's really straightforward. We must enforce existing Iran sanctions to include stopping Chinese purchase of Iranian oil, and we must permanently freeze Iranian assets around the world. Iran has earned a shocking $80 billion in oil revenues since 2021. Its once meager exports at the end of the last administration are now over 2 million barrels a day. Let me say that again, 2 million barrels a day in the face of our sanctions. Not only does this supercharge Iran's support for terrorists, but the lack of sanctions enforcement provides Iran with greater resources to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and China with greater access to oil to pursue its dominance in the Pacific. Third, we must restore deterrence. There have been, as the chairman noted, at least 170 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan since October 7th. It's clear the Iranian regime doubts Biden's will to impose serious cost. It's time to do things differently. We must dial up deterrence and force the regime to take notice. Fourth, we must demonstrate American leadership. Iran's support for Russia, quashing of protests at home, and attack against Israel have forced many of our partners to rethink their approaches to Iran. We should be leading those efforts. Finally, we must better support the aspirations of the Iranian people. The Iranian people are disillusioned and at a breaking point. The lack of concrete response from the administration has missed an opportunity. I cannot overstate how bad policy has allowed Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea to move from being transactional partners to strategic allies with each other. This is a failure of American policy that will have consequences for years to come. This committee has a clear role in shaping Iran policy. We have several pieces of legislation in front of us, including my bill to better enforce oil sanctions. Many of these Iran-related bills, like the SHIP Act, have already passed the House, and I look forward to working with the chairman to push these over the finish line. In closing, I'd particularly like to thank Mr. Hook for being here. The threats against you and your family in connection with your past work as the U.S.-Iran envoy are unacceptable and underscore the threat that Iran poses to Americans. With that, I'll turn back to the chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hook, first of all, let me say yours and Secretary Pompeo's efforts against Iran are legendary, And of course, thus you're suffering the consequences of it today with threats against you and your family. It's hard for me to sit here and believe that a country all the way around the world, and the nature Iran is, that they can actually deliver threats to you and your family here in the United States, which is just a despicable act. So thank you for your service, and thank you for what you've done. Let me ask, you know, as you pointed out, things have changed dramatically in the last 3 years. And with all of the money that's flowing into Iran now, are you surprised at all that they're firing up the proxies to do the kinds of things that they're doing?
I had hoped, in light of the hand that the Biden administration inherited, that there would be sort of a greater continuity of peace. In the last 4 months of the administration, we negotiated, in the last 5 months, we negotiated 4 peace deals between Israel and Arab nations. I think that we had put Iran in a very defensive position, and we were a very good friend to our partners, and we were very tough on the Iranian regime. I think that's a winning formula for the region. And I think that the United States over the last 20-something years has struggled to find the right calibration, get the pendulum somewhere in the right place. And I think this administration inherited a pretty good hand. I think they put all of their focus on getting back into the Iran nuclear deal. And as a consequence of that, they wanted to create, I think, positive negotiating atmospherics for that. And that meant relaxing all of the oil sanctions that we had so vigorously enforced. And I think it also meant looking the other way on a lot of Iranian aggression. In light of the understandable objective to deal with the nuclear problem, that's number one. That is the biggest problem that we face. Proxies are secondary. I think my view on the Iranian regime is that you're more likely to get the deal you want with crippling sanctions. And that if you create this sort of positive environment, Iran is going to play cat and mouse with you for as long as you will let them. And then I think at some point the administration sort of figured out that they were not going to be able to get back into the Iran deal. There has been some increase in sanctions. I think the administration should have announced that talks are dead. By always leaving that door open, I think it prevents them from doing the necessary things on oil and banking sanctions that would dry up the revenue for Iran and its proxies. Hamas receives 93% of its finances from Iran. Hezbollah receives 70%. Iran is, the first check that Hamas was written was in 1992, when Yasser Arafat said that the Iranian regime gave them $30 million. In a very short time, that number went up to $100 million, then to $300 million. And they have trained thousands of fighters. The IRGC has done that. Money is the sinews of war. Iran understands that. If you don't go after the money, it's just not a serious strategy.
Well, I appreciate that. Has anybody from the current administration consulted with you after you left, your thoughts as to how we might achieve what I think is the goal, as you noted, of everybody on this committee, and should be everybody in this administration, the last administration? Has anybody talked to you about how they could ratchet up their efforts to match what you guys were doing in the last administration?
There was one meeting I had that was suggested by a friend, and I don't want to say who that was, but it was a senior person in the administration, and we got together and had dinner and talked about it. So there was one occasion.
Thank you. My time's almost up, but Ms. Maloney, I wanted to touch bases with you on something. On your website, there's a quote from you saying that we have a rare opportunity with Iran, and that is an Iranian consensus on the benefits of engagement with the U.S. My feeling is your thoughts have evolved on this to maybe a little different position than what's stated there, but it doesn't indicate when you had those thoughts. Has your thinking evolved on this?
Yes, I think that there was a period in time in which negotiations with Iran proved that they could be fruitful in terms of getting concessions on real security risks that we have with respect to the regime. I think that time is now firmly over, The current leadership within Iran has no interest in making concessions to the United States. So much of that has to do with the changes in the international environment since that time, their very close relationship with Russia, and the increasing reliance on China as an economic partner. Those were not the conditions that were in place at the time of the negotiation of the 2015 nuclear deal. At that time, we had consensus from both the Russians and the Chinese, as well as the wider international community, on the need to apply pressure to Iran in order to achieve these concessions. We no longer have that international consensus. It's a much harder road to hoe.
So are you now in agreement with those of us who believe that we need to turn the screw really, really tight if we're going to get something done?
I believe that pressure will achieve results with respect to Iran. I think that it is more difficult because it does invoke other interests. We should be working with the Chinese to try to persuade them that it is not in their interest to see a wider conflict in the Middle East and that Iran is a bad actor, not a useful partner. But we have many other interests with respect to the Chinese, and I understand why the Biden administration was reluctant to try to go after Chinese firms as aggressively as it should have in order to try to achieve those results. I think, again, in the situation that we're in today, it makes very good sense to try to continue to reduce Iran's oil exports and its revenues.
Thank you. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator.
Wait, before we do that, can I'd ask unanimous consent to, we have a letter from a group, United Against Nuclear Iran, which I think is pretty instructive. I'd like to include that.
Without objection, it'll be included in the record. Senator Menendez.